Welcome everyone to the 2020 IACM plenary session, Pursuing Racial Justice and Inclusion Through Engagement. So as we look around us, there is really and has been a clear and urgent need to address systemic racism, all types of racism and discrimination in our communities, workplaces, and really everywhere. So as conflict scholars and practitioners the world over, it seems like we have an opportunity to use our resources, our capital, to affect needed change. So in this session, we are fortunate to be joined by four gracious experts to identify ways that we can seize this opportunity. So Dr. Dolly Chugh, our moderator, is an associate professor of management and organizations at NYU's Stern School of Business. And not only does she bring her expertise in negotiation, implicit bias, race, gender, and discrimination to the table, but she also brings her experience teaching at a men's correctional facility in New York, where she's running a book club. Our panelists are Professor Sheryl Wilson, Dr. Martin Davidson, and Dr. Peter Coleman. Professor Sheryl Wilson is the executive director of the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Bethel College here in Kansas, and the executive director of the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. She's also published in a recent book available through Living Justice Press called Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities. Dr. Martin Davidson is the Johnson and Higgins Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and the school's Senior Associate Dean and Global Chief Diversity Officer. His expertise and research in diversity, leadership, and performance is widely published, including in his book, The End of Diversity as We Know It, Why Diversity Efforts Fail and How Leveraging Difference Can Succeed. And last but not least, Dr. Peter Coleman is a professor of psychology and education, director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and co-director of the Advanced Consortium for Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at the Land Institute. He's written extensively on conflict intelligence and systemic wisdom, sustainable peace, intractable conflict dynamics, to name but a few areas. So thank you to all of our panelists for being so generous with your wisdom, your time, and your experience this evening. And for everyone listening in, if you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat box. That chat box will be moderated, and then this will also be recorded so that people who aren't able to join live will be able to view it later. So panelists, the session is yours.
Thank you so much, Greg. Hi, everybody. I'm Dolly. It's good to have you all here. What we're going to do, because we are all coming from different affiliations, institutions, fields, in the chat box, if you don't mind, I'm going to just model this. If you could just drop in like super brief, like I'm going to write, I'm at the NYU Stern School of Business, and I come from a social psych OB, organizational behavior background. And if you don't mind just dropping that in, we'll have a sense of vocabularies and frameworks, and so we can sort of work towards shared language and an exchange of ideas. So we'll just let people add those in, and then I'll get our conversation started while we do that. Our format for today is I'm going to pose questions to our panelists. For the first question, we're going to kind of have an order they go in, and from there we hope it's going to get conversational, where I'm going to keep dropping more questions their way. We'll look for your questions in the chat box. If you don't mind putting a Q, like a capital Q, to start your question, Q:, then we'll know that's a question we should be looking out for, and I will feed your questions to the audience. If there's any elaboration needed, I may just ask you to unmute and share your question directly. Finally, we will totally pivot to Q&A by 7 o'clock, or 7 o'clock my time, which basically 55 minutes from now, we will fully pivot to audience Q&A by then if we haven't already morphed into that sort of format by then. So that's our plan for today. I'm going to find, there's Martin, there's Sheryl, there's Peter. I see them on my screen. Martin, Sheryl, and Peter, we're going to ask you in that order to get us started with sort of bringing us closer to who you are. You each work in areas that intersect with racial justice, with inclusion, difficult conversations, and it's obviously deeply essential work, but it's also work that sort of comes usually from a very particular place. Can you share with us how you came to this work and what's shaped your perspective of the work along the way? Martin, may we start with you? And welcome.
Thank you, Dolly. It's really nice to be here. IACM is my old stomping ground. I started my career back in the early '90s, and so it's nice to see some old friends. And unfortunately, we're all really old.
Some of them look young, Martin. You and I, they look young.
It's the quarantine and the isolation. No,
right.
But to answer the question about sort of where I began with, as I reflect on this question, it probably started as a Black kid in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1960s, which is where I was born and grew up. And I never considered myself sort of an avid champion for justice. I've never sort of been strident. I've attended some protests and things like that, but I've never sort of been out in the forefront. More than anything else, the work has evolved and sort of grown around me. Is the way I feel about it. It's been a function of my own experience as first a young Black kid, as first a kid who lived in the city and then ended up, because of racial riots, leaving the Cleveland public school system and going into a private prep school, which then tracked me into a different educational track and ended up at Harvard and Stanford and so on and so forth. And I think by going through that, I began to get some insight and sort of have an experience about the dynamics of race, dynamics of racism. And then I began to adopt that into my own work on conflict management across race. A wonderful colleague, Ray Friedman, did lots of interesting work in that regard. And from there, it evolved into, interestingly, thinking about my sort of semi-Buddhist practice and the ways in which I began to sort of think about what it means to cross boundaries, what it means to be on the side of living a life of a primary identity of subordination around race in this country, and to begin to see the other side, the side that I think about as the dominant, the side that some will call the oppressor, and to think about the interactions and the people and the groups in a way that brings a kind of insight and compassion to it. And that actually, for some people that sort of may sound kind of strange, but in fact, it's deeply informed my work, both the intellectual work and the academic and scholarship work, as well as the practitioner work. And first my consulting, and now the job I have in Charlottesville, Virginia as Chief Diversity Officer here at the University of Virginia. I started July 1st, 2017. On July 8th, the Ku Klux Klan came. And on August 12th, the Unite the Right came. And so that sort of is kind of how I'm in this particular mix.
Thank you so much, Martin. There was so much there I didn't know about, and I'm sure we'll get to hear more about that as we dig deeper into your work. But thank you for getting us started. Yes. Sheryl, welcome. May I invite you into our conversation and ask you how you came to this work and what's shaped your perspective along the way.
Well, thank you. And greetings, everyone. Grateful to be here in the sweltering North Newton, Kansas. I feel like I'm in an oven when I walk out the door. I'm a Floridian by birth, so I'm used to heat, but I like my heat with a little water in it. So I won't say much more than that. But I come to this work, I could somewhat relate to Martin in my orientation as an African-American woman comes from the Deep South. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, which is in some ways South Georgia. But Tallahassee is a special place. It is not, it is very diverse. I feel like I've come from a center of the universe in the sense of the colleges that are there. There's an HBCU, Florida A&M University, which shaped me in ways that I could never acknowledge fully until I got older, how rich a background I came from, being just in the community, and being able to attend an institution like that has shaped me in ways. A Different World was on TV when I was coming up at that time. So if you look at Hillman, that was somewhat my college, the beginning of my college years. And then Florida State University is there. A smaller college, Tallahassee Community College, which is not so small anymore. One of the largest community colleges in that region, I believe. And I'm a graduate of this community college area, so I hold it down for the community colleges as well. And I also was raised by two people who were the firsts in their communities to do things. My mother is a teacher. She was a third grade teacher. She was that teacher that you wanted to have. I'll just leave it there, but you understand what I'm talking about. And then my father was the first African-American firefighter. Then he went up the ranks as the first African-American to do those particular roles, and he retired as a deputy chief. And so I feel like they poured so much in me to be beyond what that civil rights movement era time that they came out of gave them. I'm fortunate to have that as my beginnings as I started to figure out where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. Journalism was my desire. I thought I would become a journalist, but along the way, I began to look at the ways people communicate in conflict and began to be drawn to mediation. And then I took a course that changed everything for me on restorative justice, and I've never looked back since then. And so for me to marry the concept of, you know, the holistic ways that we deal with conflict through restorative justice, looking at all stakeholders, victims, people who cause harm, people who have been harmed, and community members working together to examine harm and how to repair it. So for me, taking all that movement that I got from civil rights era and matching them with restorative justice has kind of brought me to this, what I call sweet spot in time. Not that this time is sweet, don't get me wrong, but I feel like for the first time, the things that I've been saying for many years are finally being heard, and listened to and valued. And that feels wonderful. For anybody who's in conflict resolution, you must celebrate this moment with me. But that's kind of my background. This is what I feel is the substance of how all of these areas kind of intersect for me. So thank you.
Sheryl, thank you so much for taking us into that journey and for reminding us of something that I know I've struggled to remember recently, which is that there is, in this moment, there is something to celebrate, and there's many seeds that have been planted and buried that are finally growing. So thank you for reminding us of that, Sheryl, and we look forward to hearing more as we go into our discussion. Peter Coleman, we'd love to invite you into our conversation and hear more about how you came to the work you do and what's shaped your perspective of the work along the way.
Sure, Dolly, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's very surreal to see you with little windows on my computer. I am Peter Coleman. I'm in New York City. I'm honored to be on this panel as a white man and a member of the oppressor group. I think it's critical that people like me be involved and in these kinds of experiences, mostly to listen, but also I think to help others think through our role in this and what needs to happen to move forward. My background is, I was born in Chicago in the 1960s, which was a cauldron of civil unrest at that time. There was violent protest, anti-establishment protest. King eventually moved to Chicago and altered his strategy at that point, so there was nonviolent strategy happening. And I was aware of this as a young kid. I had older siblings who were involved. It was a progressive family, so I was mindful of all of this tumult. We would drive around and sort of see and experience some of it. So I think I grew up with that component. I went originally to a Catholic school, and it was one of the first desegregated schools in Chicago. So I experienced busing firsthand, and made some of my first friendships across racial lines in, I think, 4th grade. So that was a very vivid thing. But then I'll just sort of jump ahead. My work, the way I got into conflict in psychology is that I was working in some psychiatric hospitals, mostly with young violent youth and mostly boys of color who, many of them had gotten in trouble with the law, were inpatient, trying to kind of reduce their sentencing and figure out how to move forward. And so that's when I first started to work in this field. And it encouraged me to, I didn't know what I was doing. I was doing what was important work, but I wasn't clear on how to do it. So I found this guy, Mort Deutsch, who was at Columbia, who was eminent in both conflict resolution and social justice work. He did, very breakthrough theoretical and empirical work on that. So I went to study with him. And I got interested in different aspects of that, but particularly one of the things I'm interested in is that, the conflict resolution field is largely about getting to yes and, finding harmony and de-escalating conflict and helping people manage it constructively. And the social justice field moves in a different direction, and almost the opposite direction. It is about increasing tension, increasing awareness, increasing our sense of the injustices in which we're embedded, and drawing attention to that. And so I became interested in that fact, that you had conflict resolution practitioners trying to reduce tension, you have social justice advocates and activists trying to increase tension and mobilize attention to problems. And so what we've been working on at our center for the last 8 or 10 years now is trying to understand, like, what is optimal tension? How do you encourage universities, schools, universities, organizations, governments to see these moments, like the George Floyd protest moment, as a necessary opportunity to awaken a sense of injustice, as Mort Deutsch would say, and mobilize that energy to real reform, as Barack Obama has made very clear in his response to the protests. What are the priority strategies? How do you take that energy from civil unrest and conflict and frustration and move it into real reform? So that's what I've been interested in. I've done that work practically for years now. I continue to do that work practically within institutions, but I've also just been interested intellectually in, what does that mean, sort of optimal tension? King wrote in the letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote about something that he called optimal tension, which was sort of a, non-violent tension, but mobilization of that. So I've been very interested kind of intellectually in that, and then finding ways to realize that in the institutions that I work with.
Thank you so much, Peter. That juxtaposition between conflict resolution, trying to decrease tension, and social justice, trying to increase tension, is one that I had never heard articulated in quite that way. And I think it captures some swirling thoughts that had nenever made sense to me until you put it that way. So thank you for giving us that frame. Now that we've had a chance to just get a tiny little bit of a a sense of our three panelists. I'm sure you, like me, want to hear a lot more. Now, please feel free, as you think of questions, if you could just put them in the chat box with a big capital Q up front, so we know it's easier for me to be air traffic control here and find your questions. As you think of them, feel free to add them. In the meantime, I'm gonna invite our speakers to comment on a few questions on my mind. So when each of you was so forthcoming with sharing your lived experience with us and sort of your origin story, if you will. So can you say more about, based on your own experiences, what do racial justice, what do inclusion mean to you? Like, what has that looked like in your lived experience? And please, any of you can get us started.
My pause is thoughtfulness.
I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. It's you know, as the Peter's comment about optimal attention, I found sort of compelling as you talked about it, because my sense of it is being someone who sort of has experienced himself interpersonally as someone who tends to be more avoidant in conflict. Interestingly, I study conflict because I hate it.
Well, research is research, Martin.
There we go. But also very much trying to find what are those optimal strategies? What are the ways that allow us to bridge and connect without sacrificing the learning and that happens amidst the engagement? And I'm always very much about that. My first psychology professor was Ellen Langer, and she said, I remember in social psych, she said, there are people who read the New Yorker, people who don't read the New Yorker, and people who don't read the New Yorker anymore. She said the last two groups look the same, but they're not. And when I've thought about sort of racial reconciliation, I've often thought about it, and Erica James and I have written about this too, about the kind of reconciliation that's deep, authentic reconciliation that comes by having traversed through the conflict, through the identity abrasions, through the real social and structural barriers. That when we come through that's a different kind of connection than when we just kind of pretend that that's not there, and let's just not worry about that stuff. Let's just come together. So I, in my own work and in my own personal, I think, philosophy, I've always been drawn by that. I've always been drawn by what is that path and what can take us and what can we learn about that in our research to help us understand how to navigate that, and how to differentiate the fake sort of kind of let's all be friends from the real depth of work. I'm always struck by that finding around the asymmetry, such that in relationships, such that oftentimes a white colleague will be asked, say, who's your great friend or who's your best friend? It's like, oh, it's my black colleague Martin. It's like we're as tight as anything. You ask Martin, and Martin is like, yeah, Fred, whatever, he's fine. Because we're experiencing the relationship in very different ways because of the nature of that work. And part of my no, please go ahead.
No, I just said love it. That was great.
Yeah.
Can you, I may be the only one in the room, but can you, the New Yorker bit, I didn't get it. Can you explain what that means?
Oh, I think she, I'll try. I think what Professor Lang was saying was simply that you, at time end, you look and sort of see someone and they look like they're doing exactly the same thing. Which is making the point that one person has never read the New Yorker. The other person has read it a lot and then just doesn't read it anymore. And that person is not reading it for a different reason than the person who sort of never read it.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And that's always a parallel for me in terms of being friends with white people. It's like, you know, it's like, have we done the work? Have we engaged? Have we been able to talk authentically about race and racial interaction as part of, not the only thing, but part of what we talk about? Or are we avoiding that?
And I would love to hear Sheryl and Peter's reactions to that, if you have any, or your own lived experience on these questions of what racial justice and inclusion mean to you, what that's felt like in your lived experience.
Yeah, I was thinking, Martin, when you were saying that, I was thinking about the one black friend thing, but I won't go there. But I thought that was the road you were going down. No, I think that's interesting because in our field, we often talk about the conflict that happens when your movie is playing one way and somebody else's movie is playing totally different around the same scenario. And I do think that we perceive each other differently, and that is part of the challenge. And some of that plays out in the ways that we encounter each other racially. I think for me, just kind of getting to the heart of the question, what is racial justice? What is it, and inclusion, what does it look like to me? I think, if we could say perfect world here, I'm thinking that people come to, they come in community in ways that nobody has to be smaller to allow someone else to take up space. No one has to apologize for the way that they show up, in the ways that they look, the ways that they speak, their educational background. None of those things have anything to do with how we want to connect with each other, but we often rank and value and engage or choose not to engage based on those things. We elect, and in my opinion, I call it investing. There are people that I take a personal assessment in community, whether or not I'm going to let them into my world. And a lot of that is telling them a little bit about where I come from culturally, what's acceptable, what I appreciate, what people from my background might appreciate. But I'm not going to say that to everybody. But I feel like if we're being aspirational, then that is what we're doing. We're revealing ourselves and our secrets. My mother would say, "You are telling our business." If I choose to let you in on something that's more of a cultural secret, if you will. And so if we're thinking aspirationally, we're open to those ways of engagement. But again, we're accepting each other in ways where we don't have to align ourselves. And I'm not using the harmony word because I don't think it's about getting along. I think it's about owning who we are, to the extent that when we step across the lines and we do have conflict, which is normal, and it should be acceptable. What happens is when we see conflict now in society, we're ready to what? We're ready to stop. We're ready to take some action to stop it. And sometimes we're so quick, before we even know that it's a problem, we've called law enforcement to come in to manage something that we know, like if we can just go to the circumstances around some of the deaths that we know about just recently. What would have happened if the police weren't called in those situations and people got help in other ways? Those people would be alive today. And so in that way of engaging, that we think about how we show up in ways that we are not threatening each other with the next level of concern, so that we can fix things. So I'll leave it there.
Sheryl, thank you so much. It's really powerful to hear this idea of, I think you described as investing, and then your mother's phrasing of that is telling our business of the cultural secrets. Is that like from a conflict standpoint, do you view that as something that happens before a conflict, or is it preventive? I'm trying to connect some of these really powerful points you've shared with us about conflict is normal. We need to figure out how to address it, not escalate it, and the sort of trust required for the investing you described earlier in your comments.
And I believe that is, you use the word trust. I mean, I think that is indeed the challenge, is we don't trust everyone. And now we're in an age where we trust less and less. I think about how we grew up. I mean, what is interesting to me is, without design, I think all three of us might have come out of the same era almost. I'm not going to say my age, but I have a feeling that our lived experiences would have happened around the same times.
Yeah.
I grew up in a community. When I say I grew up near FAMU, I grew up darn near on campus.
Yeah.
So for me, everybody looked like me. And I'm talking about successful people who were doing things. Just, it was no big deal that some of the coaches lived by me, their kids. I played with their kids, some of these professors and people who did all kinds of amazing things in community. And I just was one of those neighborhood kids. We didn't worry about everybody. You know, I came from the neighborhood where everybody's mother was everybody's mother. And you got disciplined by everybody's mother.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that way, the trust was just automatic in our communities. What has happened, obviously, is we don't have that in the communities we live in now. And I will ask, maybe some of you have this, and I live in a small town. I will say, what is cool about living here in North Newton is everybody does know everybody, and everybody's darn near related to everybody too. And I love that. I love that. I live like in a little teeny Mayberry, but I mean, that's highly unusual for me. I've lived in a lot of other places, and I have to give a big shout out, because I did not name my second home is Minneapolis. And so city, total city, a lot. And of course, with the recent challenges there, I know all of the backstories along the issues around George Floyd and the communities and all of that, the impact of all of that has occurred. But that was my community, like, you know, in the big city way. And so I didn't know my neighbors, but I'll tell you, I made it my business to know my neighbors, not because it was put upon me or whatever, but I just don't know that we have that kind of trust to invest. But as I make an intentional choice with the people in my community, because I know for me, it's about my survival. And I'll say, maybe if I was white, I could be invisible and I could choose to not know people. But when you are a person of color and you do that and something happens, you will wish you had made some connections.
Yeah.
And that's why I say sometimes it's really simply about survival. You could pretend like you blend in, but you really don't. And so that investment in some ways is a lifeline. And I invite others to share if their feelings were opposite. But for me, that very much is part of how I move through the world. I think it's important. And yeah, sharing my business. I probably share more of my business than my mom would like for me to.
Yeah, that's probably true of me too.
Yeah, but I'm rather enjoying the people that I take those risks with to share about where I come from.
Thanks, Sheryl. What we're hearing so far, I mean, I feel like, I don't know everybody's specific areas of focus on this call, but just scanning the quick bios in our comment section, I think we're hitting upon so many shared areas of interest and themes while putting the context of lived experience around it: conflict, dispute resolution, relationships, trust. There's so much bubbling up here, so I'm really excited to hear everyone's thoughts on it. Peter, we somehow ended up in the same order again, so we'll bring you in on this question of what racial justice and inclusion mean to you and what they've looked like in your lived experience.
Thank you. So much of what both Martin and Sheryl said resonates with me. It is interesting that we're in some ways all out of the same era. I imagine very different experiences, but there's certainly some common ground. I guess when I think about the question, which is a big question, I think about it as on a personal level and then on a kind of macro level. And on a personal level, I think Martin, you used the word work. Are they doing the work? And to me, it is a full-time job. It is about learning. You know, as I said, I came from what was a progressive area. I came from a diverse area, but you know, I remember having an epiphany. There's a man in Ken Soul who does workshops, and I did a workshop with him probably 25 years ago. And I had this epiphany because I was born poor working class boy in middle America. And, you know, I think my son and I counted at some point, I think I had 43 different jobs in my life, you know, bus driver, dishwasher, you name it. And
wow.
So I worked my tail off to make things happen. And so long I held that sort of sense of pride in that, you know, that I've sort of pulled myself up. But in this kind of encounter group that Ken organized, it was a multiracial group. And I had this epiphany, which is that, you know, there were two other men in the group that were two African-American men, one who worked at Fortune Society, which is a NGO in the city here, and one who was was an older man who was the first Black congressman for the state of Maine. And what I learned that day or that week was, you know, I got those 43 jobs. You know, when I applied to be a paper boy or applied to be a dishwasher or applied to be whatever, they hired me. And that was the difference. You know, the difference between me and these men is that most of the time they weren't hired. And that kind of popped a bubble in my head. It was like, oh my God, you know? So yeah, I've worked hard to make things work, but I look a certain way, and that was always an in that I wasn't even aware of, right? And that's just an illustration, I think, of the kinds of bubble pop experiences I've had and continue to have. You know, when I read Ta-Nehisi's book, Between the World and Me, which is a bleak account of where we are today with little sense of what to do, you know, it is a bubble pop. And so, and when I see the lack of progress that happens in our society and the constant killing of, you know, people of color, particularly Black men, you know, these are constant reminders of this unbelievable sense of injustice that's built into the fabric of our country. But it is work. It's constant work. You know, I mean, at a macro level, what I will say is that, you know, the work I do around institutions usually get triggered because there's a lawsuit or there's something big that happens at the university or at a college, and they call me in and say, well, you know, we got to do something around diversity because there's all this heat right now. And, you know, right now, the United States has, you know, more recently been feeling more of that. And I think that's a promising thing. You know, one of the things, I won't get into this too deeply, but one of the things about change that we know is that qualitative change, significant, profound change, not, you know, incremental, marginal change that happens at the, you know, on the edges. But when communities, systems, groups, institutions change in a qualitative way, it's usually because something big exploded. You know, something happened. And you may not see that change right away. Sometimes it's not linear. It leads to changes, which leads to changes, and then you say things change. But that's true in organizational change. That's true in international war, the end of international rivalries, that there's always that kind of destabilizing factor. And so the fact that we are today living through a pandemic that this government has handled so terribly, living through a government that has been, there aren't words for it, but that has done so much damage to this country, consequently we're living through economic downturn and this resurgence of unrest around racial injustice. We are in a cauldron, and it's a painful time, but I have to believe it's a time of awakening, and it's a time of opportunity, and it's a time for all of us to really think carefully about what are the big structures that have to change, and what does that look like. So I'm both exhausted and stimulated and hopeful that out of this mess that this country is in, and that the pandemic is shining a hard light on as well, that real reform can happen. But I think it takes people like us, this group, people that are educated, active, intentionally attempting to affect change. It takes certainly beyond us, but it definitely takes groups like us to make a difference and make a commitment at this time. So, I continue to do my work, and I'm hopeful about Obama liked to say that the arc of justice, bends, the arc of history bends towards justice. I felt like in the last few years that it broke, but maybe it is a time for real change and not just marginal change.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, you said that the pattern is that big change follows big things happening, which probably feels a lot like something breaking. One line that I've been telling myself over and over again is, this is what dismantling feels like. Like, yeah. Dismantling is not comfortable. It's not a smooth ride. It's to the point earlier about tension up or down. It's tension up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Peter, let me you took us to the macro, and that brings us to the topic of systemic racism, and that's been embedded in some of the comments so far. But let's hit that explicitly, and I'll share. I'm trained as a social psychologist, which means I sort of think mostly as an individual unit of analysis and unconscious bias. I mean, I'm not even like I'm in the head really. And when I wrote a book about the topics I study for a general audience, and I was about a third of the way through writing this book, I was interviewing people for real world stories, and they kept using this word systemic. And I mean, in theory, I know what that word means, but like in reality, I had no idea what they were talking about. And, again, trained to think in terms of individuals. And one of the biggest ahas I had in working on that project was realizing how important it was to make the systemic visible, because it's so baked in. You just gave us one very concrete example. You said, I've had 43 jobs in my life, which, by the way, oh my God, wow. But I got those 43 jobs. Right. Can you help us make visible some of the systems that, if we're going to bend the arc, does it go this way or this way? I'm not sure, but we're bending it. Yeah. What systems in particular do you want us to think about? And Sheryl and Martin, we'd love your thoughts as well on this.
So I'm glad you asked that question. I'll do this fairly quickly, but if I can share my screen.
Sure, do it.
What I want to do is put this on. And this is,
whoa,
you can see it. So this is from an article that a bunch of us published in 2017, which is trying to explain why institutional reform around diversity, equity, inclusion is so painstakingly slow and oftentimes beset with, backsliding? Why is it so hard to affect real change? And what we did is we went into the empirical research on what are the factors that at the individual level, at the group level, and then at the more organizational or community level that are reinforcing either more destructive multicultural dynamics and racism and discrimination, or are promoting it. And that's what this is. And this is an attempt to, show that system, or at least show pieces of it, right? But what the research, so when organizations, are being threatened with a lawsuit, what do? They do training. Let's do implicit bias training. Let's do training, of how to have difficult conversations. But what the research shows, there's great research on this, is that training has no impact, or the least possible impact, of all the categories of interventions in organizations and institutions, unless there is a full commitment by the leadership on monitoring, mobilizing, funding, and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion work throughout the system, right? So what we tend to do are the things that are easier to do, that feel like they're packages and are least disruptive to the system. But when this is the system of problem, or not just this, but when these individual factors start to kind of feed each other in complicated ways, and there are more and more of those factors that are feeding each other, so you start to look, it starts to look like this. This is that set of elements kind of feeding each other. When this is the problem, then training doesn't touch it, right? Or hiring a Black professor doesn't touch it. It requires thinking more systemically, and thinking in a much more comprehensive way. And so that's what we've been trying to do, is really study the resistance to change around diversity, equity, and inclusion as complex systems that fundamentally resist all good faith attempts to change, or most good faith. Again, there is marginal change, but there isn't qualitative change that's sustainable. And why is that? Why is it so hard? And so that's what this paper has done, and we've done a bunch of work in trying to implement the strategies that come out of this. And it's informed by complexity science and what we learn, why do cancerous cells get stuck and not change? And why do galaxies get situated and not change? And what can we learn from the study of those things that help us understand the conditions under which real reform happens? So when you ask about systems, that's what I think of.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for giving us some visuals around that. Some of us probably couldn't read the font, but we got that. It was complicated.
Well, Dolly, and I want to pick up on Peter's point, which I thought I love the visual, Peter, and I especially love the last one, which I think creates the fundamental dilemma, right? Which is, I work with leaders and organizations. I work with sort of, trying to sort of now emphasizing and trying to focus them on thinking about systems change, but they can't figure out that diagram that Peter showed.
Yeah.
The complexity of it is so beyond the scope. And I'm not saying, something wrong with them because they're dumb. It's very complex, right?
Yeah.
And so people look for the, for the key under the street light. I don't think, I can see it. So they end up doing the diversity training and the bias training and so on and so forth. But I think you're right. I think part of what's critical here, at least part of what I'm focused on, especially in this particular moment, because I do believe that the moment we're in now is an open window that will close.
Yeah.
I'm fairly confident that pretty soon the tolerance for engaging, and some of it comes, I think we've all talked about this in different ways, but it comes from just the sheer pain of dealing with the realities around racial injustice, is that when we're in the dominant privileged position, it's kind of like, I'm just not going to do this anymore. As part of the privilege. And so I think the question then becomes, how is it that we create a way for people to step into the systems change? I'm not sure at all that I've cracked that nut. I've been intrigued, Peter, by both what you and Sheryl are doing in terms of how you get people to organize in ways that allow them to attack the systemic. I think that's critically important.
Thanks, Martin. Sheryl, thoughts on systemic racism, systemic change?
one of the things that we say in the South is we call it tradition. There are ways, and I'm just speaking as a girl coming to a very white place from a very diverse place, coming to Minneapolis in the late 80s, trying to figure it out and not even getting how so not. Like you talk about being invited to dinner and then there's a group that's invited for dessert. I was probably the group that came for hors d'oeuvres and didn't even get to the meal because I was so not aware of how I didn't fit into this, whatever this was in terms of community. And there are so many unwritten, like everybody gets an employee manual. If you work for a big company, you get one. And then there's so many unwritten rules and norms. And people of color often are not, they're not factored in for certain, but they're so not factored in that it's like, you can't even have the conversation. There are times when I knew, when I talked about that investing thing, I knew it was so dangerous for me to even attempt. That sometimes it would be easier for me to leave a job. And that's what you talk about, the 43. I am sure I had 43 or more. Not all, I was pretty fortunate, I will say. I felt very, you know, whatever it is, being young and very clueless about whatever the steps were. I relationally connected a lot to get jobs. But I will say it's not about getting the jobs, but it's staying in the jobs. That really is the haves versus, that divides the haves versus the have-nots, right? I think that's the key, is sustainability. And for me, the thing that I had to reckon with is people were not going to even let me come to the table without knowing all of those norms, all those things that are passed down that you know so-and-so who know a so-and-so, and they will get you this and they will do that. It took me a long time before that started happening to me. And I just know with systemic racism, what happens is there are ways that there are codes that are written, there are policies that are implemented that have that factor out people of color. And if you don't have A plus B equals C, and sometimes it's A plus B equals C and it's C squared, like you are so not gonna, even if you got A plus B plus C, you're not gonna get it. Because there's somebody who's factored in so much higher and so much more brilliant in the sense of showing up, not because they're smarter, but just because they show up better than you, that you will not even be factored. So for me, that dismantling thing, Dolly, that you talked about, that's what I talk about. I wrote a chapter in a book called Colorizing Restorative Justice. Just came out. I'm so proud of a group of practitioners in restorative justice of people of color who have written their chapters on how they work in a field where we've had to grapple with how we do this as people of color, and we still do good work, and we still get recognized, and we still do the work. We are doing the work. We did the work, and then we're doing the work. If that makes sense, I hope that resonates with some people. It's based on the twice as hard, you know, but the idea of dismantling, my chapter is called Calling Out Whiteness. What it's like to work in an all white environment or predominantly white environment and survive. as a person of color in the restorative justice field in particular. But I think so many of the things I write about are universal to many people who are people of color in all white environments. But I talk about this idea of dismantling it. And I say, I have been more emboldened in these times to call out whiteness and white privilege in many settings, and most especially in my field. But I say that, I call it that because I inform those who are in power or leadership that as a person of color, I recognize that the creation of predominantly white work settings is a form of white supremacy, and I ask them to recognize it as well. So when I see it, I name it, and I say this is wrong. I just name it, because there shouldn't be any landscapes where we are in 2020 where there aren't people of color at all. And it should, for white people to live in established groups. I don't want to name names. I don't want to go to talk about organizations. But when I see things like that, I shut it off. I shut it off. I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to stand for it. And I will tell people that should not be. Why aren't people of color involved in this? And so to me, that whole idea of systemic, it is so pervasive that we are in 2020 still talking about this like my father did. It hurts me to my core that we're still talking about this.
Yeah.
And I can walk over to my campus, and I know, no offense to the people here who are great people, but I am one of less than 5 Black faculty at my institution. And it's a small one, but still.
Thank you. Thanks to the three of you. I mean, so when we talk about systems, we are talking about things that are so pervasive and so, there's all the metaphors out there, the fog, the smog, the water we swim in, that they're almost hard to see. But we've heard now, just to capture a subset, we've heard about social norms, we've heard about the residential living patterns. Underneath those residential living patterns are all sorts of laws and structures and policies that led to that. We've talked about tradition. We've talked about social networks. Like, all of these things are bubbling through all the comments, and I'm sure I'm missing a number of them that were captured in our comments just now. We are at the hour, so I want to start moving us towards your questions. I saw one earlier. Let me scroll back through the chat, and thank you for all the sites people are adding. I just added Sheryl's book, the chapter that Sheryl wrote for the book, Colorizing Restorative Justice. Martin and Peter, if there are sites or books of yours that we can include in this, if you don't mind dropping them in. I'm not quite adept enough to Google and do this skillfully at the same time, but I'm sure people would appreciate hearing that. I'm going to scroll back to the question that was Ray Friedman asked, what is racism? Fear, anger, ignorance, hatred. Otis Jarvis added the possibility of competition. What do we know about what we're talking about, Martin, Peter, and Sheryl, when we say racism?
I mean, the one thing that I'll say about it is I think the distinctions around the racism, there was always the language distinguishing prejudice and racism, right? And I think there are a number of really dumb arguments about this. They somehow separate, can a Black person be racist, and so on and so forth. I think the notion of the individual bias and prejudice that we carry, and the ways in which it creates ways in which we diminish our view or degrade our view of other people, that's clearly a challenge. That's a piece of it. Call it whatever you will. For me, my eye is very strongly on the structural entities that maintain inequities and inequalities, that do everything from just diminish the experience of a people based on whatever group characteristic, all the way to literally killing them. When I think about what racism is, that sort of is the place that I dwell on. Even as a psychologist, when early on in my career, where I sort of tended to shy away from the structural pieces because I felt I had a greater comfort and felt like I had some control over the psychological individual pieces. But now I'm really driven to tackle these structural pieces because I see the harm they do, and also on the positive side, because I see that when some structures are changed, the way it improves the experience for so many people. It's like a, what is it, a big swing, big well, whatever the metaphor might be, but big swing, it sort of makes a big difference. And so I'm oftentimes thinking about that, and I think that's for me at least, it has some very tangible meaning in our current reality, which is I'm thinking about my own school, my own institution now, and we're trying to figure this out. There are a number of us who sort of have come together as faculty from different schools, and we've been talking about what can we do that begins to change the way in which diversity and inclusion is taught at business schools. And I find this, if I were to use that as a lesson, and Ray, I'm departing a little bit from your question, I know, but I just want to say that addressing this structural piece, when I look at sort of what we've begun to do, it has to do with collaboration. And so it has to do with the capacity for us to come together as groups of people to bring, ironically, diverse perspectives on how to create change, and then to affect our institutions. One of the things that some of the cohort of people that I'm working with is that we all now have extended in our careers and we have institutional power in our respective institutions. So as a senior faculty member, I can sort of push through inclusive classroom training for our faculty. I realize in large part because people do what I tell them to do because they want to be promoted. I have no problem with that, especially when it's done for their good. But I mean, those are the kinds of strategies that I think are important. And for every colleague, I'll just throw this out there, for every colleague who sort of has been tenured, and I'll share with you sort of advice that was sent to me, every colleague who's been tenured, which is a really wonderful accomplishment, but you find yourself, well, am I going to go for full? I don't know. I encourage you to keep moving, because the more you're able to move and ascend and gain influence and power in your organization, the more you can affect the kind of change that matters. So I just kind of got going there. But
yeah, no, awesome. Thank you, Martin. Sheryl, Peter, anything to add on what is racism? Or do you feel Martin covered it?
I feel like we've touched on it quite a bit, but yeah, I don't have anything really to add. I think it's just more of the ways that we use our power. For me, when I see it and I recognize it, especially doing the work that I do, it's like strategizing in ways to not just confront it, because I know I said I call it out, but I don't just stop there. But I also challenge people to think like, and I'm going to say this as a person of color being asked to do many things, because most people, when you're at a predominantly white institution, your people's diversity choice most times. And so in that, I have started to choose, and I've also started to look at the authenticity of the people who are asking me the question about whether or not I participate in a certain initiative, group, whatever. But I will say what really is difficult for me is when I'm asked to do something last, or I'm asked to do something on the tail end when all of the decisions have been made and all of the whatever the people, as Martin would say, if you have the institutional power to do something, but you are not using that power for good if you're not thinking in terms of who you're bringing with you to the table and what underrepresented voices you're bringing into that conversation. If you choose all the people in your peer group that look like you and come from the same trajectory as you, again, you're doing a disservice. And if I see that, and if I see I'm the only one, I still feel like it's necessary to talk about it and call it out. And so for me, it's building a rubric that says I am intentionally bringing certain voices into the conversation, into the meeting, whatever, and building from the inception. Because I talk about this in my chapter as well, is just from the inception of a project that you are thinking that inclusively, not along the way, and most certainly not at the end. And I know that's the rub for many people of color. They get called in at the end so that they can be the window dressing in the end for a project. And so in all of that, the racism is just so pervasive that it continues to bubble up to the extent that you're still somebody's final choice. You're never the first choice. And so those are things to consider in what this is and how it shows up.
Thank you, Sheryl. Thank you. And I think one of the questions that I didn't ask but was on our list was, what is anti-racism? And I think you've articulated very specific, concrete actions we can take that are anti-racist, and to begin to speak to some of the questions that are in the chat box. Before we do hit the chat box, Peter, though, I think you had a thought on this.
Yeah, just quickly, it's a powerful question that Ray asked, and when you asked it, mine went in two directions, and one is very consistent with what both Martin and Sheryl said, which is power. Racism is power. It's a form of power and control over somebody else, right? Or over another group. It's the same as sexism, and it's the same as any other ism, right? It's a justification of what I have. It's a capacity to get more. So to some degree, racism is power. It's a form, it's an abuse of power. And so I was interested in what both Martin and Sheryl said, is that they were also saying, use your power to keep it in check, right? And to push back and as a counterweight. So I think, this is often largely a power struggle. But the other thing it is it is a disease. It is a pervasive disease that makes the oppressor sick and the oppressed sick and the society sick. And it is, the original sin and the original disease of this country. And it is such a pervasive cancer upon this country. And so I think it's both of those things. It definitely is about power and control, but it's also has all of these deleterious effects on all of us.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to our chat box and bring in Lori Weingard's question. What can the conflict management academic community bring to this conversation? How do you think we can be most effective? What do we uniquely bring, people who do this kind of work? Thoughts?
I'll say for myself, most recently, clearly we've been wrestling with all of the, needing containers for a lot of the angst that people are feeling around the reactions to the killing of most recently Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and now there are a few others, Rayshard Brooks, but just thinking about how we respond. For me, I know when I took some time to actually sit and I made myself watch the video of the 8 minutes and some seconds long video of George Floyd's killing. And I did that on purpose because I felt that I didn't want to get that third hand. I wanted to understand exactly what happened as firsthand as I could. And I needed to have a way of processing that for my own personal benefit. But I also knew that others were feeling the same way. And I asked on a national level if people would be willing to come together to talk about this. And we used circle process for those of you who are familiar with restorative justice, restorative practices. Normally, if you were in person, you would be sitting in circles. We have been able to adapt that to do virtual circles. So we brought together hundreds of people to sit in virtual circles with folks to be able to process some of the happenings that have occurred recently, because people need ways to decompress, to have a container, and to also feel the safety of being able to have this shared experience. I think what happens often, of course, is it comes out sideways in community where people are not set up to have these conversations, and people don't know exactly where to go. And so what's been fortunate about what we do is we can provide these containers and ways that we can have dialogue. And the other thing that happens out of this is as we're having these conversations, we're building community. And so then when things happen, we're not feeling so disjointed and alone, but we're able to have places to go. And I think that's what I want to use my platforms for, is to give people places to go to have healthy dialogue about hard things that people normally don't have places to go to talk about.
Awesome, Sheryl. So I just want to capture that before I want to hear from our other two panelists, but I want to repeat exactly what you just said. I was scribbling it down. We have the skills, everyone in this room, Zoom room, to provide the containers for dialogue, to build community, and to give people places to go to have hard conversations. That's a concrete, actionable, powerful, inspiring example. Thank you, Sheryl. Peter, Martin.
I just wanted to offer actually a humble counterpoint to what Sheryl was saying in terms, and to answer this question. And it draws, and I really do need you all's help in terms of updating my data, but it draws on my experience with the conflict management community, with this conference, with the CM division at the Academy. And one of the things that I would say that, drawing from that, is that my experience at the time, and granted, this was 20-something years ago, but my experience was that there was very little diversity among the community. And that may not be true anymore. So if that's the case, then yahoo. To the extent that it is true, I think one thing that the community can do is to begin to develop its voices around these particular issues. So what is, for example, I think there are many, to Peter's point, there are many isms that could be engaged that would be really, really relevant for this particular community. But we're talking about the racism. Where are the Black voices in this community, and how are they being heard? That's one of the questions that I would bring out. And I think there's a technology behind that. I think it's all about making sure, obviously, we talk about having people at the table. It's about the ways in which we learn to listen to marginalized voices. All those things are important. But my insight is simply that when I draw on my own experience, and I tell you, my experience both in this conference and in conflict management was, in so many ways, it was awesome. Just tremendous people. I really love the people in conflict management. It's like my first love, academic division, community. But I was always alone. And I ultimately drifted away from it because in that aloneness, I couldn't achieve the things that I wanted to achieve. I couldn't learn what I needed to learn. And I wasn't in a position as a younger scholar to know how to use my voice, even in its solo status, to influence or to be a part of. And so that actually, the capacity for this community to change that dynamic opens the door for the kinds of structural action that needs to happen, that your insight, that your intelligence, that your scholarship can impact. But I think, apropos Professor Langer's metaphor, it's like you can go out and try and fix stuff, but if you haven't actually engaged with the voices yourselves inside your community, it's not clear that you're going to be fixing the things that need to be fixed. And so I offer that.
Thank you, Martin. Engage inside your community, whether it's this community and all the other communities and institutions we're part of. Peter?
Well, so I wanted to pick up on something on Martin's point, because I completely agree, have experienced that myself through the years. And I want to give a shout out to one of the things that this group, the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation and Conflict Complexity at Columbia, has done with IACM over the past 10 years or so, maybe not that long, but something like that, which is that in recognizing the overwhelming whiteness and white Europeanness of IACM, our small contribution has been a pipeline contribution where we've offered stipends to traditionally marginalized members of the community in the US and to people from developing countries around the world to encourage the diversification of ICM and ideally the field through ICM. So that's one small way that we thought over the long run might make a difference if we can help 10 people show up to a conference and meet other people and basically not be alone, as Martin described. So Dolly, remind me, what is the question I'm answering?
Oh, Peter, you sound like me. What was the question? The question was about what can we do in this community, or what can people in this community do outside of this community or inside this community that's unique to be able to do conflict management work? So
the one other thing I'll add then is I put a citation for a paper, or a link to a paper on the chat, which is a paper by Beth Roy and Lou Kreisberg, where they wrote this, I don't know, 15 years ago, and I thought it was a fantastic paper because it's a conversation between people who do social justice work and people who do conflict resolution work. And it really is about, why do we not talk to each other? What do you do that we should learn from? What do they do that you should learn from? And it lays out some of these issues. I mean, I do think that the restorative justice movement that Sheryl's involved in is the sort of epicenter of that connection between justice and conflict work. But I think that the field more largely can learn from these two movements, and they can learn from each other. And that paper lays it out really nicely. So that's all.
I know, Beth, so yes. So I ditto that. Can I, and I'm sorry if I jumped over
go.
Here. I wanted to respond to something you said about the conference, in that, and Greg is aware of this, when the conference was going to be in person and before all of this happened, the group who wrote this book, 19 other authors, and our editor, we were very interested in coming in mass to attend the conference and engage in the ways that you're talking about in reality, because we felt like we wanted to learn from you all in ways that we probably aren't interfacing in that same way, and vice versa. We were hoping that we could bring something that would be content-wise that would be of interest to all of you. So we hope in the future, as this project evolves, we would be able to do that and really show up and be present, be fully present with this community. So.
Absolutely. And I'll offer, and we're hitting upon a couple of questions that are in the chat. We've sort of woven them in. I'll plug a paper that Brian Lucas presented yesterday at one of the sessions some of you may have been at, that I'm a co-author on, where we're exploring what we call the longer shortlist effect, the idea that a lot of things, you just sort of think of the first few people or a slate for a job, for an opportunity, for a conference. And the prototypical people come to mind. And when we prompted people to make a longer short list, we were studying gender in this case, they on the longer short list tended to produce names of women. When we're thinking about this conference, particularly because it's so interdisciplinary, and so there is an opportunity to really pull from fields, and it doesn't have to be your sort of prototypical Academy of Management negotiation researcher, which in my world would be the prototypical attendee of this conference. There may be a different prototype in your world. Maybe if each of us think of not just 3, but 6 people who don't typically attend this conference, but whose work would intersect with any number of the themes, and encourage them to come, whether we're virtual or physical in the future. Because one of the things we know is so intimidating about conferences, and particularly conferences where you're stepping into a community you're not already part of, is that horrible feeling where everybody's having drinks and you would have gone if anybody had thought to ask you, or there's all the inside jokes, or everybody hugging. And so are there ways in which we can actively think about the people we know beyond the prototype, 3 names deeper, who might be interested in this community, in this work? I'm going to try to get one more question in. I know we're at 7, sorry, I keep saying the time. I know we're in different time zones. We're at 25 after. I want to get to, there was a question from Jeff Thomas. Here it is. What are examples of more useful and less useful structures and contexts for diversity discussions in universities? Everyone can see it in the chat. I don't know why I'm reading it aloud. Features that we can nudge or control at diversity discussion, town halls, might include airtime distribution venue, etc. We'll take one or more thoughts from our panel on this question.
The one design feature that I would add around that structure is the capacity to have small group
like breakouts.
Yeah, breakouts. Well, breakouts if you're having sort of some kind of plenary, or one of my students actually interestingly sort of instituted small dinners. And so he got funding from the student office, and he would sort of, he wasn't the host, he would just get from different people to host. And the only criterion was that you had to have a diverse set of students, and diverse meant that broadly, and you had to be talking about something that was related to diversity and identity over dinner. But the key design feature we keep finding here at Darden is, and maybe this is just about us, I'm not sure, but just such anxiety and fear about talking in large groups around these issues and topics, and much greater comfort in doing it in small groups. And interestingly, I just taught my course this past spring, and this was a surprising piece of feedback, which is the students said they really loved Zoom breakout rooms. And they said, because the Zoom breakout room obviously was a small group context, but they also said, and I felt fully safe there. Because when we're in person, you never know who's going to walk by, but nobody can walk by in a Zoom breakout room. And so it was a very interesting, and one student in particular, a few students mentioned this, but one student said it changed their experience of the course because they felt like they could actually talk about things and, make mistakes and so on and so forth. So small group is the big takeaway structure that I think is really critical for this.
Thank you so much. Anything else, Sheryl or Peter, you would add to Jeff's question?
And this may be controversial, but I would say affinity groups are important to have conversations with people from your walk of life, background. I think we spend a lot of time in mixed company having these conversations. And while in some ways they are courageous conversations, there are ways that we must be able to connect with the other folks who are like us. And there's safety in that. I think a lot of times, sometimes we feel as people of color like we're the only ones that this has happened to or is currently happening to. And then come to find out, we meet somebody and it's like, oh, that was your experience too? Oh, that we should have talked. But especially the people of color having an affinity group, because a lot of times if the institution is predominantly white, it's not intentional, but just by design, you are probably very separated from and siloed off from other people of color to not be able to have those conversations. So at Bethel, that's my intention this year. We've had a lot of diversity groups and all of that, but my intention is to build that affinity group with folks of color to be able to be together and talk about what is, and to be able to build safety in that.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. And I've heard lots of anecdotal evidence that affinity groups, we don't have to limit ourselves within our institution, that we can look for ways to cross, especially when numbers are small, as you said, 5, that there's lots of shared experience that can even happen across institution, industry, sector, field. Thank you. Peter, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, which is not unrelated to the previous question about the field and what it can do, is I think, action groups are critical. That, there are groups like Hope in the Cities is one example that have great dialogue forums for community members that then move into specific actions that they can take together that they're particularly well situated to address. And I would say that's true in organizations and universities too, is that, if you have a discussion group or a book group or a dialogue group where you're sharing stories, make that next link to, well, what is it that this group could do to really address some of the structures that got us into this conversation in the first place? Because that's been my experience, is that, these conversations are critical, they're important, but they're a first step in a process. And so think through what, ideally what emerges that group can take on.
Thank you. Peter, what was the name of that you just said?
Hope of the Cities is one. There's on our website, the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution website, I think Danielle Kuhn, who is the acting director, is on watching this, and she'll send a link. But there is a link on the website of resources of dialogue, community-based dialogue facilitation groups across the country that are doing work. One of them is Hope in the Cities. It started in Richmond, I believe, and it really is about race work initially, and now it's branched out. But they're very intentional about moving beyond dialogue, beginning with dialogue to enhance understanding and connection, but then mobilizing into taking on the structures. And I think that's a great model that I would recommend people look into.
Thank you so much. And Sheryl, there was a question somewhere in the chat about the groups you were leading as well, if that's something that you're still doing and you want to pop a link in there.
Somebody asked about virtual circles. Where can they get more information? There's probably, if they want to just reach out to me, I'm happy to direct them in some ways. And then we, as NACRJ, National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, we are going to be continuing to have these dialogues. One of the next ones we're doing is going to be on this whole idea of how we take the conversation into constructive ways and talk about the defund the police kind of conversations. And we'll also have some speakers who will be able to, from their own lived experience at the beginning of before the dialogues, to share. And so that promises to be a rich experience. I think we're going to be doing that in 2 weeks. If people go to nacrj.org, that is the organization that will be doing that through, or our Facebook page. And, we'll have information about the next dialogues that are coming up where we can invite folks to attend.
Thank you so much. And Lauren Weingart has just blown my mind by explaining that we can save the chat by hitting the 3 dots. For those who want to capture all these resources, here I've been doing this like copy paste thing. And
Oh my gosh.
Where have you been all my life, Lauren Weingart? That just blows my mind. Folks, we are at time. I have learned a ton I'm going to close this out with something I recently wrote about in my, thank you, Taya, for plugging my newsletter and my book, which I'm too shy to do myself, but I'm grateful that she's willing to do it for me. I just wrote up a piece for this newsletter that's speaking to Martin's worry that the window is closing. And I'm desperately, along with many of you, trying to hold that window open as long as we can, that people are listening and learning right now. I am worried though that the frenetic pace of everyone's like panic is going to lead to burnout. So the newsletter I started last month, which is once a month, a 5-minute read, actionable advice, I offered something I'm calling the 10% more rule. The idea is if you are new to this work, like you had no idea, you thought we were living in a meritocracy, and we're not, and the evidence is clear on that, then what we need to be right now is 10% more mortified. Meaning right now, it must be mortifying to see what's around you and inside you, and the human tendency is to shut down at this point, rather than continue to feel so much mortification and perhaps shame. Instead, we want to lean into it. Just 10% more. Research on goals says we need challenging but attainable goals. We can do 10% more. If you've been in this conversation, but sort of on the sidelines, maybe on the bench, cheering, maybe hashtagging, maybe volunteering, maybe donating here or there, 10% more means 10% more terrified. It's time to get in the game. It's time to draw a hard foul. It's time to ask that tough question, to use the power Martin referred to, whether you're tenured or not, you have power of some other source. 10% more risk taking, bet on your values, bet on your beliefs. And if you've been in this conversation a long time, Sheryl, you described some sort of the feelings of this moment, and you may be exhausted. You may be being pummeled by requests due to the color of your skin or the work that you do day in, day out. 10% more in some ways is 10% less, in the sense of it's 10% more satisfied, in quotes, not satisfied with the world, but satisfied that those of us who are new to the game or going in off the bench and into the game, that it's our turn to do 10% more, and you can breathe, you can step out of the game and know your spot in the starting lineup is always there for you. So what I hear in this conversation is I think we're all in our own spot in doing this work, and 10% more is doable for many of us, and it looks different for each of us as we move forward. Martin, Peter, Sheryl, y'all blow me away.
Dolly, that was fantastic advice. Thank you so much. That's beautiful advice, and I'm thrilled with this panel. I hope to see you all next year at IACM.
It was wonderful. Thank you all. Thanks.
That
Really
was
nice to return.
wonderful, and it was a pleasure meeting all of you.
Yeah, thank you, Sheryl. I'm going to look for our organizers. Is there anything we need to do before we log off and hit that leave button and everything evaporates? No?
I'll just put in a plug here, since Sheryl mentioned earlier how she was looking forward to being together in person. So Sheryl and all of you, I hope we're able to be together in Greece next summer in Thessaloniki, and we would love for you to come and join us. If we have to do a remote conference, or we choose to do a remote conference, we welcome you there as well, and we hope this is not the first time, or not the last time we'll be seeing you. So thank you all, and the same goes, of course, to you, Martin, Peter, for returning to IACM, and Dolly, and thank you all, and hope to see you next summer, and at future sessions later tomorrow.
Very good.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a wonderful session. Appreciate all that you shared, and we really do hope to see you further in the conference and engage with us again next year. So cannot tell you how much we appreciated all that you shared and have contributed to our conversations this year. It's really important.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day, evening, morning, wherever you are.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.